quorum, and we have our witnesses present. The only unusual part of this first hour will be that Mr. Fisher is intending to move a motion, which I understand all parties are in agreement with, and he'll do that just prior to his point of questioning, but that should take virtually no time at all. We will have a hard stop at 4:30, regrettably, so I'm just advising witnesses of that because we have to go in camera after that, and it requires some technological changes which are way beyond me. But that's what I'm advised. So we have today Vice Admiral retired Darren Hocko and Maria Popova, professor at McGill University, who are carrying on just an absolutely tradition of excellent testimony. And so I'm going to call upon Vice Admiral Hocko first for his 5-minute presentation, and thereafter Professor Popova. So.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the opportunity on short notice to join you today. I'm a military practitioner with strategic experience in NATO and with the CAF, and I was involved in the writing of Strong, Secure, and Engaged and was the Chief of Force Development before my appointment with NATO. So I understand requirements, capability development, and strategy, and my comments and answers to questions will be addressed in that vein. I think the writer block analogy applies. If you've written yourself into a corner, you probably did that a couple of pages back. So it's important to understand the context of how we got here as the basis to decide what we need to do about it. I think the place to start is with Putin, who most agree is the decision maker. 16 years with the KGB, doing a lot of unsavory dry work, turning people, etc., resulted, I think, in a person who perhaps has less regard for the human condition as the average. In 91, on the dissolution of the Soviet Union, he joined Yeltsin's camp, not Gorbachev's, which shows what he thinks of those decisions. And from 99 to today, he was the prime minister and president in various capacities of the Russian Federation. And he put in really significant and impactful early focus on reform and the economy, which had significant value for the Russian Federation standard of living, et cetera. But it also probably created a lens on how he would have thought Gorbachev perhaps should have solved the problem of the Soviet Union rather than allowing it to fail. Putin would have observed the Russian Federation decline as the bipolar superpower, with NATO expansion at the expense of the Russian Federation. You know, in 97, in 04, in 09, 17, and 20, 14 countries left the Russian Federation sphere of influence and joined NATO. So, you know, a person could understand how he blames the West for going back on words spoken, notwithstanding the actual words in the NATO-Russia Founding Act. How would Putin decide he could stop that pattern of behavior? Well, he could take a chunk of a country. Got a border dispute. If you have a border dispute, you can't join NATO. That's what he did in Georgia in 2008, and again, arguably what occurred in 2014. The Russian Federation, that was why Putin fought to address that as prime minister.
Admiral Hocko, for some reason or another, you seem to be cutting out, and I just want to make sure that we're kind of keeping up here.
Sure.
Are the translators okay? Are we good?
The interpreters just say intelligible when he cuts out.
Sorry, I missed that.
The interpreter will just say intelligible when the witness cuts out.
Okay. I don't think we can do much about it at this point. So I apologize again for interruptions, but welcome to 2022.
Sure thing.
Please
so
continue.
I think the Russian Federation would have seen that steep decline in their economy, particularly challenging without a lot of the Soviet state capacity in the Ukraine, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Bulgaria, et cetera. And that meant that they're more relegated to a resource economy. And that partially explains recent expanded United Nations Arctic claims made by Putin, and also maybe part of his motivation in relation to the Ukraine, because that was a significant industrial capacity element of the Soviet Union. In the last 70 years, Russian Federation actions, generally speaking, are opportunist, but they're against a broader strategy and with strategic intent in mind, with kind of a freeze-thaw mentality, as I've heard other speakers in previous sessions with you speak about. And that means, in recent years in Georgia in 08 and the Crimea in 14, They take an action, they allow the international community to move on, and then they look for other opportunities. And that speaks to their use of information confrontation, we would refer to as refined in recent years by Valery Gerasimov as the Gerasimov doctrine, really just combining military, technological, informational, diplomatic, economic, cultural, all kinds of tactics to achieve specific strategic goals. So if I wrap, Mr. Chair, I would say only Putin really knows what he wants, but predictably, he wants recognition. He doesn't want a bipolar world. He wants, as a minimum, a tripolar world with US and China and the Russian Federation involved. Reasonable or not, he wants to stop eastward NATO expansion. Some will say there's no place to go. Well, of course there is. There's the Ukraine, there's Georgia, there's Azerbaijan, there's Finland, Sweden, Austria, Moldova, Serbia, Bosnia-Herzegovina. He wants NATO to stop this eastward progression. He wants a sphere of influence, and he needs to broaden his economy, and he's a human, so he probably has legacy in mind. And in our sense, what are the types of things? Sanctions, yes, but consider he has operationally planned this a couple of years ago. So he's planned and accounted for sanctions to a certain extent. If you think about what the Chancellor of Germany, Olaf Scholz, has recently said to the Bundestag, which I think is illustrative, they've put Germany 100 billion euros for armaments, a commitment to exceed 2% of GDP for defense spending. They've adjusted their energy policy intentions to avoid long-term dependence and other industry policy decisions. And they've committed to, of course, the reinforcements that one would expect for NATO missions and activities. And most importantly, I would argue the Chancellor marks this as a turning point in German foreign policy in favor of alliance and efforts through the EU and the United and NATO. Our corollary, perhaps, as Canada, would be the Five Eyes and NATO. And with that, Mr. Chair, I'll turn it back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Admiral Hawko. Professor Popova.
Hello, thank you, and thanks for this invitation. I am a professor of political science, and I have worked on Russian and Ukrainian domestic politics for about 20 years now. I have extensive experience researching the political processes of both countries, and I've written articles and books about it. What I want to talk about today is the political root of the crisis, and as you'll hear in a second, I have a slightly different view from the admirals, so you will get a broad range of views here. The root cause of Russia's invasion of Ukraine is the view expressed many times by Putin, but also probably held by a portion of Russian elites and society, that Ukraine is not a real nation and should not be entitled to its own state. The dissolution of the Soviet Union was a tragedy, according to Putin. He has emphasized this numerous times, and he is working right now to restore it and here I agree with the Admiral, he is working to restore it with a view towards his legacy. The dissolution, one key point actually that I wanted to emphasize here is that this rhetoric from Russia lays bare the fact that NATO's eastern expansion did neither precipitate nor hasten this crisis. NATO is the issue to Russia. I'm not going to say that it's irrelevant, but it is behind in importance to the reunification of the Russian and Ukrainian peoples. Even former Russian President Gorbachev, or Soviet president rather, Gorbachev has opined recently that he always thought that the separation of the Ukrainian and Russian people in two states would cause serious problems. So this is first about this issue, and then only secondarily about security issues. So wrapped up, however, in this worldview is really a very gross miscalculation about how strongly Ukrainian citizens are attached to their national identity and to their independent state. The resistance that we see from the Ukrainian army and the Ukrainian population at large shows that Russia's expectation with which they went into this war, that they would easily advance to Kiev as the Ukrainian army lays arms down and the population acquiesces, has turned out to be false. Ironically, this Putin and partly Russian view undermines rather than advances Russia's stated security interests in the region. Had Putin taken Ukrainian independence seriously, the current crisis could have been avoided. Even after pro-Russian President Yanukovych was driven out by a popular uprising in 2014, Russia could have achieved many of its security goals through soft power. No NATO expansion into Ukraine. Ukraine has never been even close to joining NATO. A Ukraine that was separate but largely friendly to Russia, and continued levers of Russia's influence over the political process in Ukraine. More pro-Russian and more pro-Ukrainian presidents alternated in power throughout Ukraine's 30 years of independence. And Russia had important levers of economic and political power in Ukraine. All that was needed was for Putin to recognize the 2014 events for what they really were, a domestic upheaval against an increasingly authoritarian and unpopular president, rather than a Western plot against Russia. He went with the second interpretation, and this is where we're at now. Now, I also wanted to address the broader issue of how peace can be achieved and what security and political situation we have once these hostilities end, which we hope is sooner rather than later. The latest news from today is that Russia may be willing to start talks with two preconditions, that Ukraine should disarm and stay neutral outside of NATO, and that the West should agree to formal recognition of Crimea as Russian territory. For now, these are non-starters, but we really need to start thinking about what peace may and should look like. Agreeing to disarm is equivalent to capitulation for Ukraine without any security guarantees from somewhere that Russia would not invade again.
Professor
Ukraine,
Pavlova,
yes.
could you wind up? We're past your 5 minutes at this point.
Okay, sure.
Please, thank you.
Sure. Let me mention that the biggest problem of this is that Ukraine needs security guarantees, and also the problem of recognizing Crimea is that this is a threat to the international rules-based order. Now, the reality, and this is what I want to say really briefly, the reality that Europe and North America are faced with right now after this Russian aggression is that a new Iron Curtain will be descending in Europe. After this war, Russia's neighbors and any states that were part of historic Russia will not feel secure from Russian attack. The EU and NATO members have the structures through which to think about how to deal with this hostile Russia in the future, but the non-EU NATO members in the neighborhood will have to figure out how to avoid being sucked into Russia's sphere of influence or worse.
Unfortunately, we're going to have to end it there. I'm sure you'll
Absolutely.
work those points in as members' question.
Yes.
I apologize. I have, for the 6-minute round, Mr. Doherty, Mr. Fisher, Madame Normandin, and Madame Matheson. So, Mr. Doherty, 6 minutes, please. Mr. Doherty, we can't hear you. Can't hear you now.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now. Yeah, it's a little. Try it again.
Testing 1 2 3 1 2 3.
Yeah, up it a little. Madame Normandin is having difficulties.
C'est au niveau de l'interprétation, on mentionne que le micro n'est peut-être.
The interpreter believes
They're saying that maybe the mic has not been connected.
We're wondering if maybe your microphone isn't plugged in, or if you could just unplug and then replug it, just to double check that.
Testing 1 2 3 1 2 3.
Okay, Todd, restart.
Professor Popova, last week Conservatives called on the government to take additional actions to show Canadian solidarity with the people of Ukraine We call on government to declare Russia's ambassador to Canada persona non grata and expel him. Would you agree that in this time of a global crisis,
Sorry,
Canada should take
Mr. Doherty, sorry again. What's the issue that it's kind of yeah, your mic is now too close to your mouth and it sounds, okay.
testing 1, 2, 3? 1, 2, 3.
Okay, that sounds better. Okay. Okay, have another go at it.
Sure. Professor, should Canada take a stronger stance in the wake of a global crisis and expel the Russian ambassador from Canada?
To be honest, we would have to talk to the Russians in order to stop this war. So whether that's expelling is a very strong symbolic step, but somehow the talks will have to continue.
Admiral Halko, do you concur with the professor's comments?
Yes.
Admiral Halko, in terms of protecting and defending Canada's Arctic sovereignty, would you agree that there's significant vulnerabilities on this front?
That's in the question of vulnerabilities, I would say Canada has in Canada's Arctic all the access that it needs, much more so than anyone else would. We have radar sats, constellation imagery 16, 17, 20 times a day, so we know what's happening up there. That's not to say that there isn't the value for infrastructure, for increased opportunities for surveillance, which we will get ultimately through acquisitions, but I don't know that there is an imminent risk of sovereignty issues in the north. The one thing we do see, Mr. Doherty, is normal ADIZ incursions by Russian Federation aircraft, which are met with by NORAD on a very routine basis.
Should we be modernizing NORAD's early warning system?
I believe NORAD's modernization efforts that are planned and in active discussion, as I would imagine, are intended to do just that.
Admiral Halko, you talked about Putin's gray zone tactics. Have we gone beyond his gray zone tactics with the mobilization of his nuclear force?
I would say that the actions in the Ukraine, that those represent classic examples of things that are not part of what one would look at as information confrontation activities, because it's actually kinetic in nature. But the actual signaling and intent of use of nuclear assets is an example, I think, of gray zone tactics, because it's intended to sow doubt, it's intended to cause fracture in alliance cohesion or in thought process and the like. So it's an example, what I would say, of diplomatic part and military part of information confrontation.
Professor Popova, would you like to elaborate on or jump in on that question as well?
Yes, I think his invoking of nuclear escalation is signaling how committed he is to winning this war in Ukraine and how important Ukraine is to him. It is primarily about taking control over Ukraine for Putin. And that's why he's trying to divide the alliance and trying to send a signal to the international community that he should be let to do that.
And do you think he should be let to do that?
No, I don't think he should be let to do that, because Ukraine will not be the last country that he takes over. He has already de facto taken over Belarus. Belarus is used as a launching pad for his military operation. Arguably, it is no longer an independent country de facto. There's all the other post-Soviet states in the region should also fear, if the West decides to yield to Putin's demands on Ukraine, there are several countries that are in the line for that, and then it gets to the NATO members, which are probably safe only by virtue of NATO expansion.
Mr. Chair, how much more time do I have?
About 1.5 minutes.
To both of to our witnesses, Should Canada's and indeed the West's stance go beyond sanctions? Admiral Halko?
Yeah, I would say that our response and support within a NATO context is the most appropriate foreign policy decision to make right now. Canada has consistently acted in that frame of reference in terms of European security, and so it makes sense to continue to do that, recognizing the decisions that have been made by government already in terms of direct support of aid of various natures to Ukraine, who is acknowledged a partner of Canada.
Great. Professor?
Sanctions are already starting to work. The Russian ruble is crashing. The banks are under threat. Sanctions, if they need to be escalated even more, that can be done. And military aid to Ukraine is going ahead. So I think this is the way to go.
Thank you to both of our witnesses.
Mr. Doherty. Mr. Fisher, I'm not going to start the clock. I understand you have a motion, and understand this motion has the consent of the other party, so I'll call upon you to present your motion.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I want to take a moment to thank all members of this committee for being supportive of this motion, which will truly be a motion from this committee. I move that the Standing Committee on National Defense stands in solidarity with the people of Ukraine and the government of Ukraine, and unequivocally condemns A, the unwarranted, unprovoked, and egregious attack on Ukraine, which was ordered by President Vladimir Putin and represents a clear violation of Russia's obligations under international law and the Charter of the United Nations. B, the illegal invasion of Ukraine by the Russian Federation in 2014 and the illegal annexation of Crimea and occupation of eastern Ukraine. And C, President Putin and the Russian government for these hostile and provocative violations of international law and on the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. In addition, the committee calls on Canada, its allies, and the international community to stand resolutely in defense of the rules-based international order, human rights, and democracy in Ukraine and around the world. I so move.
Thank you, Mr. Fisher, and I'm assuming that everyone is in agreement with that. No need to call for debate. Those in favor of the motion as read?
Aye.
Okay, opposed? Thank you, Mr. Fisher. The motion is carried. Thank you for that. Thank you for your work. And colleagues, thank you for that show of solidarity in a much needed moment of solidarity. With that, Mr. Fisher, you're on for 6 minutes.
Much. And thank you so much to our witnesses. I'm sorry for that little delay there. I think I'll go with Professor Popova. You talked about, I don't have the quote right in front of me, about how Putin wants to rebuild the Russian Empire and how he's trying to bring the other parts of the Russian Empire back, I think you said, into the fold. If that's the case, then we've got a really big problem looming, and we can't have an international collective. In 2014, the world kind of yawned when we saw this Russian aggression, and you're seeing a totally different response now. What's next now? One of either you or Admiral Halko talked about, Putin. I think you both mentioned legacy, and you talked about, I think Admiral Halko was the one that said only Putin really knows what he's trying to accomplish. Where are we going if your quote is, and your belief in this is accurate, if he wants to, because there's an awful lot of countries out there, some of them NATO members now, that were part of the former Soviet Union, and if he's thinking about a legacy, we've got ourselves a real problem on our hands.
We really do. I think there is no doubt that he is going for restoration as much as he could achieve. As I already mentioned, Ukraine is under attack, but Belarus is de facto now controlled by Russia. What we saw in January was Russian troops going to Kazakhstan to support the president. of Kazakhstan against suppress popular demonstrations. So Putin and Russia are becoming more and more interventionist in the area that used to be the Soviet Union. If this brazen invasion of Ukraine succeeds, and the West sort of lets Putin take Ukraine, we can expect the non-NATO members of that are former Soviet countries to be next in an assault. I mean, Georgia, probably, Moldova, probably, and we should just expect that this restoration, I think what Putin has demonstrated with this invasion is that he is done with pretending to cooperate in any way with the West. He is now on an expansionist mission. He will try to get as much territory as he can, and he is prepared for another confrontation with the West. If it goes back to another Cold War, so be it. I think he is already in that state of mind.
Professor, we're seeing already that Russian people are becoming victims of Putin's hostility and aggression. We're seeing tens of thousands of Russians speaking up and standing together in protest of these despicable actions. Now, you mentioned that the Iron Curtain will close shut after this. Can you explain a little bit more about what this will mean for average people in Russia? What will life look like after this?
Well, it depends on how it ends. Because if the Russian people actually, if Russian society mobilizes to stop this war, perhaps by it would be hard to do it by making Putin give up on this war. The more likely scenario, which is early to be predicting that for sure, but if the Russian people manage to stop this war, this will be through Putin's replacement by elites somehow who are not willing to go that far and bear these costs of sanctions, or by some kind of popular mobilization that again forces the hands of elites to replace Putin with someone else. That's what, if that happens, then the Iron Curtain falling is averted. But we do not see that yet. We see some mobilization in Russia, yes, but keep in mind that Putin has consolidated a very repressive regime over the last 10 years. He's been in power 22 years, but it's the last 10 years in which he has really consolidated a repressive authoritarian regime. In that regime, it is very hard to protest. Russian people may be brave, but they may not be that brave.
So Putin has ostensibly had a couple of years to prepare for sanctions, to have some type of a buffer. Will this pressure by his own people from within, will that be something that might have more of an impact on him than maybe some sanctions would when he sees a protest and unrest amongst his own citizens?
I think Russian citizens are very resilient. They lived through a really deep economic depression in the 90s. So I think if his propaganda works domestically, Russian citizens may be willing to take a lot of economic hardship. I think it is more likely that if the sanctions are going to be effective, it'll be maybe some combination of protests, but also elite action. I think elite action against Putin is more likely as a way to stop this war.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Fisher. Madame Normandin, 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much to both witnesses. I would like to start with a retrospective of information that we discussed in several places at the Defense Committee, but also the Parliamentarians Committee about NATO. In December, we were just beginning to talk about what was happening in Ukraine. We knew troops had massed at the borders, but we didn't realize anything was happening. And then we kept wondering, will there be an attack or not? But we were thinking that maybe the Russians would use what was happening in Donbass to annex Donetsk and another state. And then we were surprised to have Russia attacking Kyiv. And I'm wondering, is that really fooling ourselves to think that there might be, in a future scenario, a direct attack against one of the NATO countries? I'd like to know to what point Canada is ready to take part in a concerted effort with the NATO countries.
Did you address that to Hako or to?
Les deux témoins.
Yeah.
For both witnesses.
Thank you. First, I think the calculus would have, we would call it conditions-based elements to it. So Putin would look at what the situation was looking like when Russian Federation military action is contemplated. They do a very thorough, they call it red teaming. There's a lot of layers of assessment about what the probability and outcomes are going to be. It's multi-departmental, so it's not just a military calculus. Speaking to your point about sanctions that a previous questioner had raised, and the question is was it foreseeable in some way? And I think the answer is yes. And I would wager that those who had the intelligence were well aware or reasonably aware of the increased probability. And of course, you never know when they're massed on the border, because they've been massed on the border in many other occasions during SNAP exercises and the like, which arguably is what they do these SNAP exercises for in the first place. And then the thrust of the question about, is it possible that they would attack a NATO ally? I think it is hard to imagine that, except in some sort of an extremis or miscalculation, that something like that would happen, because if you just look at the Balkans, or the Baltics rather, those countries, there are pretty much every ally has people there. If people were killed in that situation, everyone would respond, like everybody. It would be without a shadow of a doubt. And that kind of a situation only has one or two endings, and neither of them are really good for Mr. Putin as an individual or for the country, the Russian Federation writ large. And then would Canada reply? Have we ever not? Yes, we would. Yeah.
If I could jump in here, in terms of the predictability of this attack on Kyiv, in fact, everybody who was familiar with both Russian and Ukrainian politics actually knew that, and was trying to say early on, that an attack on only Donbass makes no sense to Putin. He does not need Donbass, he already controls it. It was clear a long time ago that the calculus is, do they attack or not attack? But if an attack was going to happen, it was going to be on Kyiv. So I think in terms of, that's related to the likelihood of an attack on NATO. I agree with the Admiral here that an attack on a NATO country is not likely because he has bigger problems to solve with controlling Ukraine. Even if he manages to take over, it's going to be really hard to control a very hostile Ukrainian population. He would just not have the political manpower capacity to turn immediately to another NATO country. So I think the chances, or to a NATO country, the chances of an attack on a NATO member are very low right now.
le right now me fait peur un peu.
That right now is scaring me. So, Professor Popova, in terms of sanctions, which you mentioned, we're thinking about Russian oligarchs are beginning to complain about sanctions. To what point can that have an impact, the fact that they get involved? And what is the indication of efficacy of sanctions?
That's the goal. That's the hope, that oligarchs who are one of the pillars of Putin's regime could be his downfall if they calculate that not only sanctions, but a longer term Cold War, Iron Curtain type of situation will basically cut them off from their assets in the West. This is right now the goal. The problem, though, is that the second pillar of the Russian regime right now are the security services, the former KGB. And that pillar is less affected by sanctions because they don't have these sizable assets. I mean, I'm sure they have mansions abroad as well, but their loyalty to the regime has a different source. It's not the regime allowing them to enrich themselves, which is the source of loyalty for the oligarchs. So it would be harder to break and to crack that part through sanctions.
Okay, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. I apologize for cutting you off,
Sure,
Professor,
no
but
problem.
seems to be I have a talent for cutting off professors. Madame Matheson, 6 minutes, please.
Not just professors, you cut us
Yeah.
off. Thank you.
Faceted that way. Yes.
I wanted to ask about, again, going to the sanctions. We know and we've been told that Putin has quite a lot in reserve. How long can he survive as we've put forward all these sanctions? How long do you think that he can survive on those reserves? To both witnesses, I guess.
I mean, I think the reserves are there, but we are already seeing the effects of the sanctions. As I mentioned, the ruble is in free fall, and the stock market didn't open because of where it would be and how hard the crash would be. So I think he cannot last very long. He has diversified his economy somewhat and tried to make it less reliable on the dollar, probably thinking that the U.S. would be pushing him hardest, but he diversified in euros, and now the EU is pushing him very hard. So I don't think he can last a very, very long time.
And I'll defer to the specifics of time, but what I will, I completely agree with Maria. What I would also add is that, generally speaking, the more integrated economy that exists today than existed 15 years ago causes greater issues. Germany's decision about Nord Stream and then its decision in relation to diversifying its energy needs base, something long discussed, but they only import 15% or roughly of their energy, Germany, from Russia, but still it's notable. Those are long-term concerns, and the Russian Federation would have gamed what they thought sanctions would be and what they could do and what they could withstand, but these are another level that we're seeing, I think, than what maybe had been predicted.
So the Ukrainian Canadian Congress has asked for Putin to be named as a war criminal. The International Criminal Court has now said that there will be investigations. It doesn't necessarily stop Putin at that stage, but sort of in a longer term thought process. I mean, in the conversation we had about targeting Putin himself, he is the one. But if he's removed internally, is he simply just, and I think that you talked about this, he is simply replaced by yet another oligarch and we have the same situation potentially. If he's replaced externally, could you talk about the ramifications of that in either, criminal court or what have you?
To be honest, I cannot imagine a scenario in which he can be removed externally because of Russia's nuclear capacity. So even if he is removed internally, I very much doubt that Russia would be willing to send him to the International Court of Justice. I mean, I cannot see that happening either. In terms of the question on whether he is replaced internally by another figure who does the same thing. I think we have to be realistic that if he is replaced by another figure, we don't expect that Russia will suddenly become, a democracy friendly to cooperate with the West. But the goal is to replace him with someone who has a more realistic view of the neighborhood, realizes that countries are now attached to their independence, and just switches to a policy where they attempt to influence the neighborhood through other levers, not by taking countries over. And I think that's a realistic chance that he could be replaced still within an authoritarian coalition and a largely authoritarian government, but with someone who does not have such expansionist goals.
And I would just offer that the GRU, the SVR, and the FSB have a different loyalty complex in play than others. And so they're the internal security apparatus that is directly responsive to Putin. And so, the likelihood of an external change absent some sort of a color revolution, which is less likely because of those entities, that it's only more likely that it would just get really complicated for Putin and he ultimately gets replaced for all the reasons that Maria outlined.
I'm not sure how much time I have left, Mr. Chair.
But we would gratefully receive any donation.
Well, and so what you were talking about, Dr. Popova, in terms of that KGB stance as well, is going hand in hand with what Mr. Harko just said in terms of that loyalty, right? That transition to somebody else. It doesn't just happen that way. That's not how you get at them. Is that correct?
Right. But I think it is still possible that that at some point the KGB, FSB, the security services will just come to a conclusion that he is now a liability, and may replace him with someone from their circles as well. Think of the defense minister Shoigu. He's not going to be a dove, but we can go back to dealing with the Russia of the late 2010s rather than the current Russia.
Okay, we're going to have to again leave it there. Colleagues, we're down to about 15 minutes, and we've got 25 minutes worth of questions here, so I'm going to just cut it back to 3 minutes each and 1 minute for the NDP and the bloc. So starting with that, Madame Gallant, 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. To Vice Admiral, so RadarSat you had mentioned is not really sufficient in our eyes. It doesn't see underwater ice. We have no submarines that go beneath the ice and cannot count on icebreakers. So we're studying the threats to Canada. How does Putin's invasion on Ukraine impact Canada's security, including countries who may wish to take an opportunity to exploit the fact that we have a distraction and perhaps even lay claims to our Arctic natural resources?
So I guess the root of my answer is going to be that the European security is a national interest issue for Canada in the sense that it's part of a deep rules-based international order fabric. So what we're seeing in terms of the Russian Federation and the Ukraine is a challenge against Westphalian structure and system. It's going to galvanize, and if the international community and the rules-based international order doesn't look to assert itself to rectify those kind of situations or outcomes, then it's a national interest to Canada and therefore has national security implications. So that's the straightforward answer. I think the Russian Federation claim to the Arctic sea basin, Arctic underneath the floating ice cube, if you will, right to Canada and the Kingdom of Denmark's economic exclusion zone is indication of Russian interest in the Arctic in the context of the 25% or so of the global resources that have been unidentified and reside there. So I think those are somewhat separated. That's a really long-term issue, and I wouldn't see it as a direct challenge to Canada's economic exclusion zone and Arctic sovereignty claims, but it does have implications for our United Nations Convention Law of the Sea application to the Arctic Basin.
Okay, Professor Popov, we heard Putin make the nuclear threat. In your opinion, would he launch a nuclear strike over freezing access to his financials and the fallout we're seeing?
Well, it's a really difficult question. That's the $1 million question, right? But I think this is more of a signal, it's more of a bluff for him right now, and a signal that he wants Ukraine really badly and is willing to threaten nuclear escalation if the West doesn't yield on Ukraine. I doubt that that's over the sanctions per se. I think what he is signaling here is that Ukraine is really important to him. But ultimately, I think it's a bit of a bluff, and I think there's others around him who may not be as willing to go that far.
Madame Gallant, that's not a $1 million question. That's a $200 billion question.
Right.
Madame Lambropoulos, 3 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to both of our witnesses today. I guess for me, it's more a question of currently they're in the Ukraine, and I understand that he wants it extremely badly, and he's doing whatever he can, threatening whoever he can so that there's no external involvement. But would you say that this is also an effort to destabilize the Europe in general and NATO? And what is the likelihood that he would, once, let's say, if he were to conquer Ukraine, go into Poland or another NATO, an actual NATO country, to see whether or not NATO would react if he is threatening nuclear weapons, responses?
I think it is definitely a bigger issue than NATO, than Ukraine, and he does want to challenge Europe as a whole. But I think if he can take Ukraine, the next targets would be other post-Soviet states that are not members of NATO. He has those to bring back into the fold before he turns to NATO. But of course, if NATO basically allows this, that's why it's in the interest of Europe, and that's why we're seeing this huge reaction from Europe. This has to stop now because long-term implications are really significant.
Similar view, but different slant. That being, I agree. This is as much about European security and the place of the Russian Federation in the world as it is anything. Of course, the Ukraine is a passionate issue for the Russian Federation, as Maria has mentioned. I would go back to that. I just don't see it likely that the Russian Federation would take offensive action against any NATO country, because the moment there is blood spilled, it changes the level of issue dramatically. And the issue of nuclear weapons and raising alert states is not atypical when you see the establishment of a movement of NATO troops towards Russia, not dissimilar in 2014, not dissimilar in response to the establishment of forces in the Baltic countries. So it's kind of a relatively normal calculus that just says, hey, let's be calm here from the Russian Federation point of view.
Madame Lambropoulos, I'm sorry I cut you off your last 15 seconds. But,
all right.
Madame Normandy,
thank you.
1 minute.
Merci.
Thank you. I understand that we're quite positive about the fact that there will not be an attack on a NATO member country, but to not be like Putin, who was surprised that the air fighting supremacy wasn't working. Is he ready to plan those things?
The plan and the suite of plans and the resources necessary to deal with at strategic scale an issue I'm sure the very high readiness joint task group commanded by France right now is getting ready. Those 5,000 troops are going to move. You're seeing individual nations increase their troop contributions outside of the alliance specific direction. And I'm very sure that the NATO response force is being accelerated in terms of readiness, just based on colleagues. So.
Et rapidement,
And quickly, is Canada a serious ally in this context?
Like you've seen in reporting deployments of ships, readiness of aircraft. I'm aware of conversations with colleagues in that regard about NATO readiness posture and following all the requirements directed by the alliance.
Madame Matheson, 1 minute, please.
So there are some countries who are aligning themselves with Russia. They're siding, certainly. Canada has put forward several sanctions against Russia and against the oligarchs and so on. Does it make sense for Canada to do that against some of the allies to Russia? Is it a place for us to go, or is it effective?
Which Russian allies do you have in mind? Belarus?
The list of countries who have been in support, I think of, I want to say Israel. I want to say no. They were
just not very quick to condemn, but I wouldn't go as far as to say that they're supporting. I think Russia is quite alone right now.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Belarus is for sure participating, but they have basically been taken over by Russia, de facto.
Mr. Motz, 3 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to the witnesses, and thank you, Admiral, for your service. I'm just kind of curious to know, Admiral, what is your view of the state of the NATO alliance and our military forces? And is Canada still considered to be a gold standard in that alliance?
You know, just a very short anecdote, which I think we'll cover off that, and then we'll preserve some time. It's, you know, I was, as a Canada's military representative, I had a NATO country come up to me and say, yeah, but we're not a big country like Canada. And we have this view of ourselves being this small country, but we have strategic mobility, we have fighters, we have a submarine force, we have, you know, we can talk about, are we satisfied with it? But that's because we want to get 95 on the test. If you're talking to someone like Croatia, or you're talking to someone like Lithuania, or you're talking to someone like Belgium, or the Netherlands, or Norway, you know, we're an enormous military with all the capabilities and capacities, including cyber, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, I do think Canada has and maintains its reputation, which is why we were asked as one of the framework nations to set up in Latvia to start with. So.
Fair to the smaller countries. What about our Five Eyes? We, you know, are we viewed by them in that alliance, you know, in the same light as the smaller countries? And what can we do to be better in our military capacity and our acquisitions?
I'll answer. There's kind of 3 weight classes in the Five Eyes as a function just of the size of the GDPs and the size of the countries. You know, I think it's fair. Your question would be, of course, we're not going to compare ourselves to the United States. And of course, we would pause at comparing ourselves with the United Kingdom, although we compare favorably in many places in many ways, but they have, you know, 2.3 times the size of the population of Canada, and not the same level of infrastructure issues and nuclear deterrent and all that. I would say we absolutely compare favorably to the Australians, and clearly New Zealand, at a country of 4-point-something million, would not compare itself to Australia or Canada. We still have the same ranges of capabilities, sir, and the same capacities, notwithstanding a lot of the hyperbole around AUKUS. Yeah.
Would we be a better partner if we had committed more of our GDP to defense?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, in the context of national security, and I think the German Chancellor's perspective is instructive. You know, he's recognized, whether you can argue, does the 2% pledge have lineage and rational economic thought behind it? It's the number that's being used. I think investment in national security capacities, which are significantly military, but not just military. And I think Mr. Fadden's testimony a little while ago about what does GAC need, what does the Communication Security Establishment need, what does the service need, it's a much more complicated discussion than just investment in the military. But is the military in need of additional resources, and is the new Westminster system in need of a bit of a process shift in terms of the enablement of the spending of resources towards military capability? Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Motz. Mr. May, final 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Vice Admiral, as NATO modernizes, what kinds of contributions should Canada be looking to make in the coming, not now, but like in the coming decades? Like I'm thinking, I'm going to give you an opportunity to kind of give us some insight into the future. How should we prioritize and what contributions, what does that look like in your mind for Canada?
I'll approach it from a policy. I'll approach it from three brief perspectives: a policy lens, a management lens, and a capability. The alliance is realizing the need for rapid decision-making capacities and capabilities, the ability to come to consensus quickly on crisis issues or near crisis issues. And so that's a place where Canada has and needs to continue to play a role at the government level by saying, hey, we need to get past discussions about why a European issue is a European issue versus a NATO issue, because there's a lot of tension between the EU and NATO. So Canada has a place and a role to play in that, and does. On the management side, Canada does a lot of work in the corners in terms of the cyber readiness of the alliance, in terms of the fiscal management of the alliance, and carries a lot of water in that particular space. And we need to continue to do that. On the capability front, we're seeing the nature of warfare is changing. We see an increasing issue of action inside the democratic institutions of Germany as a function of elections and interference by Russia, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And also the change in warfare, where it's no longer about heavy weapons and the like. It's really going to be about smaller capabilities, lighter forces, less targetable from beyond line of sight weapons and all that sort of stuff. So there's a lot of thinking that collectively we need to do to make sure we remain interoperable, so that the ones and zeros between all the countries are able to continue to be exchanged and meaningful and able to be moved quickly. Europe is big, but it's not that big. You should be able to place and move, have the posture and the logistics necessary to sustain missions at pace for a long period of time. And so Canada has and continues to and needs to continue to contribute to that dialogue about the force capabilities the alliance needs.
Is there anything that we should be changing in our defense position or that help us fill those roles as needed?
I would say that, one, we're in North America, so we've got to get there. So we've got to recognize we've got to get there if there is ever an issue related to European security. So there's a sea lift component to that. So we need to think through either it's contracting, probably that's the smart way to do it, have vessels that are able to move your stuff. But that's one area that we got to get there. Another is you just have to be ready all the time. If you're not ready all the time, then you're going to get caught short. So there's resource implications of training, of lift, of national procurement. We're talking, hundreds of millions of dollars, Mr. May, that are needed to be added to the national procurement lift. And I would argue we need to tackle procurement, and we've heard that from other speakers and thoughts on that I could share separately. But these are areas we need to deal with.
We're going to have
Thank
to
you
leave
very
it.
much,
We're going to have to
Admiral,
leave it there, Mr. May.
Thank you to all the witnesses.
Thank you. I want to thank Professor Popova and Admiral Hako for continuing this excellent series on threat analysis and threat and readiness in response to those threats. I have to say that when we began this study, we did not anticipate that we would be on the verge of a World War III. So that will change the perspective of the committee, to say the least. Again, excellent contributions, and I want to thank both of you for those contributions. With that, colleagues, we'll suspend for a minute while we go in camera.